Imagine for a moment you want to read the private notebooks of one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. You travel to a library in Paris. You ask to see the notebooks, and the librarian tells you, yes, but first you must sign a special document. A document that says you understand the risk. Because these notebooks, written more than 100 years ago, are still radioactive today. They are stored in lead-lined boxes. Lead is a heavy metal that blocks radiation. To hold one of these notebooks is to touch something still alive with energy, even after a century. Those notebooks belong to Marie Curie, and this is her story. The year was 1867. In the city of Warsaw, in the country of Poland, a girl was born. Her name was Maria Skłodowska. Later, the whole world would know her as Marie Curie. But when Maria was born, Poland was not a free country. It had been taken over by the Russian Empire. The Russian rulers controlled everything, including what children were allowed to learn. Polish history could not be taught in schools. The Polish language could not be used in classrooms. Everything had to be taught in Russian. Maria's father was a teacher, teaching mathematics and physics, but the Russian authorities did not trust him and removed him from his job. Despite this, her father believed in learning. He kept his scientific instruments at home: glass tubes, small measuring tools, the equipment of science. Young Maria would look at these objects for long stretches of time. She wanted to understand how they worked. She wanted to understand how everything worked. She was an exceptional student with a remarkable memory. She could read by the age of 4. She remembered everything her teachers said and answered every question correctly, even though lessons were taught in Russian. Her teachers noticed her. She stood apart. But in Warsaw at that time, there was one door firmly closed to her. Girls could not attend university, not because they were not intelligent, not because they could not learn, simply because they were women. For Maria, this was a painful wall. So she and her friends found another way. A small group of young women in Warsaw started their own secret school. They called it the Floating University because the location was always changing. One week in someone's kitchen, the next week in a quiet back room, moving constantly so the Russian police would not find them. And Maria made a plan with her older sister, Bronya. Maria would work as a governess, teaching a family's children, and send her salary to Paris so Bronya could study medicine there. When Bronya finished, she would send money back so Maria could come to Paris and study too. Maria worked as a governess for 5 years, far from Warsaw, far from her family, teaching other people's children while her own dreams waited. She sent almost everything she earned to her sister, keeping only enough to survive. But she did not waste those 5 years. At night, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she opened her books, mathematics, physics, chemistry. She wrote long letters to Bronya, asking for reading suggestions, teaching herself with no teacher and no classroom, preparing for a future she could not yet see. And then, at the age of 24, Maria finally got on a train to Paris. It was 1891. Paris was the center of the scientific world. The Sorbonne, unlike Warsaw, accepted women students. When Maria arrived, she made a quiet but meaningful decision, changing her name from the Polish Maria to the French Marie. But Paris was not easy. She lived in a tiny room near the university with no heating. In winter, she could see her own breath inside the room. Sometimes the water in her small washing bowl froze overnight. She had almost no money. Some days eating only bread and a little chocolate. Sometimes she fainted from hunger in her lectures, but she studied. She sat in the great university halls, one of very few women in the room. Some students found it unusual to see a woman there, but Marie did not look at them. She looked at the board and filled her notebooks. In 1893, she finished her degree in physics, graduating first in her class. 1 year later, she completed a second degree in mathematics, graduating second. She studied in a frozen room, ate almost nothing, worked in a language that was not her own, and finished at the top of her class twice. It was in Paris that Marie met a quiet, gentle man named Marie Curie, a physicist. They began to talk about science, and then they began to talk about everything. In 1895, they married. Marie wore a dark blue dress to the wedding, practical, dark. A dress she could also wear in the laboratory. Together, they worked in a small, damp laboratory. The building was cold in winter and too hot in summer. The walls leaked. The roof was low. By almost any measure, it was not a proper place for great science. But they kept working, investigating strange invisible rays recently observed by scientist Henri Becquerel. Marie discovered that these invisible rays did not come from two materials reacting together. They came from inside the atoms of the material itself, a quality built into its very structure. She gave this quality a name, radioactivity, from the Latin radius, meaning ray. Then, in 1898, Marie and Pierre announced they had found two new elements. The first they named polonium, after Polonia, the Latin name for Poland, a country that still did not exist as free. By naming this element after her homeland, Marie was saying, "Poland exists. Poland matters. We are here." The second element they named radium, from radius, the ray. This material produced a faint, beautiful blue glow in the dark. In their cold laboratory at night, Marie and Pierre could see it shining on the shelves, light no one had seen before, light born from invisible work. Marie and Pierre processed several tons of a mineral called pitchblende, all to produce even a tiny amount of pure radium. They did this by hand, stirring, filtering, separating, year after year. The physical work was enormous, the patience extraordinary. But slowly, from tons of ordinary rock, a small glowing thing appeared. In 1903, Marie Curie received the Nobel Prize in Physics, one of the highest honors in the world, sharing it with Pierre and with Henri Becquerel. She was the first woman in history to receive a Nobel Prize. But then, in 1906, something terrible happened. Pierre was crossing a street in Paris on a rainy afternoon. A horse-drawn carriage moving too fast came around a corner. Pierre did not see it in time. He was knocked down. He died that same day. Marie was completely alone, having lost her partner, her closest friend, the person who had believed in her more than anyone. For a long time, the world felt empty. But she did not stop working. The University of Paris offered her Pierre's teaching position, and she accepted, becoming the first woman to teach as a full professor at the Sorbonne. On the day she walked into the lecture hall for the first time, the room was full, students, journalists, curious visitors. She sat down, opened her notes, and began to speak from the exact point where Pierre had left his last lecture, as if he had never been gone. The room was silent. Then, in 1911, Marie Curie received a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. She remains, to this day, the only person in history to win Nobel Prizes in two completely different sciences. But even then, the French Academy of Sciences refused to accept her as a member, losing by a single vote because she was a woman. But Marie kept working. During the First World War, she designed mobile X-ray units, vehicles fitted with equipment to photograph the inside of the body. She called them petites Curies, little Curies, and drove them herself to field hospitals near the front lines, training nurses to operate the equipment. It is estimated that more than 1 million soldiers were helped by her mobile units during the war. In 1934, Marie Curie died. She was 66 years old. The cause was aplastic anemia, caused by decades of exposure to radiation, the very thing she had discovered, named, and spent her life studying. Her notebooks are still radioactive today. Her body still contains measurable radiation, and the element polonium now has its permanent place on the table of elements, studied by every chemistry student in the world, named after a country that was not yet free. And so, my friends, the story of Marie Curie comes quietly to its end. She was told from the beginning that science was not for her, not because she lacked ability, simply because she was a woman. The doors were locked, the rooms were cold, the world said no in 100 different ways. She kept going anyway, and somewhere, in a small damp laboratory in Paris, in the darkness of a winter night, there was a soft blue glow. Radium, the element she had found. Light made from invisible work. Light that had never existed in the world before she looked for it. Now, my friend, I want to say something to you. You have your own kind of darkness, your own quiet room, your own quiet work. Every word you learn is a small glow, not visible to anyone else perhaps, but real and growing, slowly, steadily, the way she did. Keep listening, keep learning, keep glowing. This is Storytime English, and I would love to hear what part of her journey surprised you most. Until next time, take care of yourself and never stop learning.